Hi, this is Mary Baca with Remotely Unique, and today I am going to talk about moving past grief and loss. Grief is our response to loss, and I'm going to talk about the many reasons why people grieve and different losses that they can experience. But because there is such a variety, it really is a shared life experience that we all have, regardless of culture, regardless of gender, regardless of socioeconomic background. We all experience loss, and therefore we all experience grief. Now, the difference is how we experience that can vary from culture to culture. So with what I'm going to share with you today, apply what seems relevant to you and discard the rest, I guess. I don't know. Okay, so reasons people grieve are some of the typical common sense ones, right? When someone dies or even when a pet dies, people are really close to their pets, and so that is really similar to when they lose a loved one. Some of us, I say us because me included, our pets are like our family members. And so when you have a pet die, that can be just as devastating as when you have a family member die. Another kind of loss that people experience is divorce or the ending of a relationship. That is like a death. And in a lot of ways, it's even more difficult if you have to continue dealing with that person, like if there's children involved or property. Sometimes those kinds of divorces can just linger and take years sometimes to resolve. So those can be even more difficult than just a regular death, if that makes sense. Even good things, people experience loss, like if they get promoted or they graduate, because there's loss involved. You know, if you get promoted, you're leaving one place to go to another, and so there's the loss of the old job, for example, if you really liked it or liked the people you worked with. And the same thing with graduation. I remember when I got both my degrees, you know, you live for that moment where you'll get your bachelor's degree and you'll get your master's degree. And then come the real challenges of life is now what? So that causes an experience with loss for people and resulting grief. Leaving home is another life experience that can cause grief for people and loss. Illness, that's a biggie. That's one that a lot of times people overlook. Is if somebody, whether they were in good standing with their health and then suddenly they get an illness, or if it's an illness that they've always struggled with, there's loss involved. Sometimes there's loss of usage of a limb, or there's loss of activity. I remember when my dad was really sick in the hospital prior to his death, he, before getting ill, was very high functioning, very active, loved doing his crafts, and he was a carpenter, not by trade, but self-taught, made all kinds of things. And when he got sick, he couldn't even get out of bed. He was bedridden. And there was a lot of loss for him around that issue and a lot of grief. So the loss of physical ability as well can be a really big cause for loss and grief issues for a person. Change of a job, as I mentioned before, a move, and even if the move is positive, that's the big thing I want all of you to hear, is that even if something is positive, a positive change, there can still be grief and loss issues attached to that or as a result of that. Loss of financial security also is another reason why people sometimes experience loss and grief. Sudden losses due to things like crimes and accidents or even suicide, those things catch people off guard and throw them into a tailspin. And one of the things with grief is it doesn't always happen immediately. I've counseled many people through the years who will go through an event where they should have grief and loss, and it doesn't hit right away. people that have been in accidents and or lost their loved ones through accidents, and they might feel numb and disconnected, or just feel like they're fine, quote unquote, and then a couple of months later, or sometimes even 4 months later, the person will start to experience anxiety and depression and things like that. Now, kind of as a takeoff from last week, the segment I did on anger, I do want to just interject here that one of the common symptoms of grief is anger and frustration and short-temperedness. So just keep that in mind. And so when you think about the fallout from loss, it can be anywhere from minimal to catastrophic. Like truly, truly, a person can become so disabled because of grief that they're just not really able to function. So some of the symptoms that you might see in a person or yourself are sleep disturbance, which might look like nightmares, night terrors, people having a restless sleep, those things. I mean, a lot of times just because you spend time in bed and you think you're resting doesn't mean you really are. Then there's also distressing thoughts. A lot of people just cannot shut off their mind. And so one of the things with grief is that typically grief patterns follow the same patterns that a person usually uses to cope with. So for example, if a person copes in life by overthinking things, which that's a very busy mind, then if they suffer a loss, their grief is probably going to look similar to where their thoughts are really going to become elevated and sometimes even out of control. And sometimes that's what will keep people awake at night. Another symptom is depressed mood or any kind of change in mood, really. A person can be one way before they experience a loss, and they can be a completely different person depending on the nature of the loss and the severity of it. Another symptom is social isolation. Oftentimes when people experience loss, they really just don't want to have much to do with anybody. And so that can be the case. Anxiety, and again, anxiety's kind of what I said a minute ago, which if a person has anxiety before they experience a loss, oftentimes that anxiety just worsens with the grief that's experienced after a loss. Now, one of the things that really makes a big difference is how somebody deals with things. We can't control most of what goes on in our life. So death, for example, we can't control losing people in our life. That's just something we can't change. We can't change or prevent one of our loved ones getting sick. I wish we could, but typically we cannot. So what happens is if a person deals with anxiety, and that's something that you can really see with the whole COVID thing and the pandemic, is the truth is a lot of people were struggling already before the pandemic hit. They already had anxiety, or maybe they were struggling with depression, and maybe they didn't even know it. A lot of people don't even know they have anxiety or depression. And so they're just kind of going through life, maybe because they've been depressed their whole life, since childhood. And then when COVID hit, I mean, it has challenged all of us, every single person, because it's a huge life change. So if a person has anxiety before COVID, more than likely that anxiety has just gotten worse with COVID. And for some people, that has really pushed them over the edge. The positive that I look at it is that it's made a lot of people get help that probably needed to seek help before for things like anxiety and depression. So I think that can be a good thing. Another symptom is difficulty concentrating. A lot of times that's something people don't really notice unless it starts to have an impact on job performance or say you're visiting with a friend and they call your attention and say, what's going on? Like, you seem really off. I've been talking for the last 20 minutes and it just doesn't really seem like you've heard anything I've said. That can be an indicator of difficulty concentrating, which can be an indicator of grief. And remember, grief is timeless. So, just because it happens today and maybe you experienced the loss of a parent a year ago, doesn't mean that grief is not still affecting you. Another symptom is frustration. And oftentimes, people who are grieving feel really misunderstood. For example, usually society and even a support system a person has expects that person should just have a time limit on their grieving. You figure when somebody dies, a workplace often will give 3 paid days, bereavement days. And after that, it's almost like people just expect that person to be back up and running normal, like they were before the death or the loss happened. So oftentimes, a person does feel misunderstood. And a lot of times people around don't understand why that person is still grieving when it's been so long. And I'll tell you, when people come in for grief and loss issues, it isn't as black and white as you would think. And what I mean by that is there's different facets. I always tell clients that one issue is like a gemstone that has different facets to it. And grief and loss is a really good example of that. So, for example, if a person has lost a loved one, they may also, and usually typically do, feel some sense of guilt and remorse. Not because they should, not because there's a rational reason why they should be feeling that way. They might have done everything right in that person's life. But for some reason, part of the human condition, we all tend to feel some level of guilt and remorse when a loved one passes away. And that also is another symptom. Another symptom of grief and loss is feeling numb, like I mentioned earlier. Just having a delayed response to feeling grief at all. And so that can be, a lot of times you have to be aware after you've suffered or lost or made a big change in your life, again, even if it's a positive change, and just really watch yourself and be aware for a few months after that. And the other symptom is lack of energy and motivation. Oftentimes I'll see people who come into the office with that symptom and they don't even tie it to grief or loss until we start to get into the history of what's gone on for them the past year or so. So one of the things with grief is to be sure not to put a time limit on it, and don't let others put a time limit on it for you either. Grief is a very personal thing. There is no time limit. And it can really ebb and flow. A person can feel really, really awful one day, and then 2 weeks later feel like they're climbing out of that hole and feeling better. And then, sure enough, the earth beneath them seems to just fall out from under them, and they feel that sadness all over again. So it kind of has that kind of situation with death. Oftentimes, a person will experience grief when they go to make that phone call to their loved one that passed away and they realize, oh, that person's not there anymore. But in between those times, they might be numb and not really experience much. So, and again, the delayed reaction, that's really, really critical. I've worked with so many people who have delayed reactions to loss. One of the things, too, that can really interfere is life and events that interrupt the grief process. So you might suffer a loss and be starting to grieve and go through your normal process, and something else complicated happens in life, because life is kind of a complicated situation, right? In many ways. And not necessarily bad, but complicated. So that will interrupt the grief process. Say somebody's grieving the loss of a parent and, job changes, there's a layoff at work, and they suddenly lose their job. Another good example that's coming to mind is when a child dies. A lot of times when a child passes away, it really causes a lot of tension with the parents. They either seem to pull together and work through it together, or kind of become at odds with each other. And so that can be another hindrance to either one of them going through grief, the grieving process in a way that would be normal. Now, I want to say that no amount of therapy or spiritual mentoring or sitting with your pastor is going to completely clear the sadness you feel over losing someone that's really close to you. That may be something, actually probably will be something you'll always deal with. That is just a loss. When you lose a loved one, we learn how to navigate through that and kind of deal with that, but we don't ever really get over it. Not completely. Although if you're experiencing grief, some of the symptoms that I just mentioned, and somebody calls it to your attention, or say you are just so unmotivated that it's starting to really make you not even want to get out of bed, then that's when it's probably time to go talk to a professional like myself, or one of the counselors that works for me, or whoever else. And then the other thing is, don't compare your grief to other people's. That's super important. Remember that gemstone. We all are our own gemstones, and we have facets to our life and to our history, going all the way back to childhood, that are all different and unique. That's actually one of the things I really love about my work, is everybody is different. And even though there's some overlapping and similar core issues, everybody is really their own unique person. So be careful not to compare yourself and your grief process to other people's. No matter what they say or what expectations the people around you might have, it's important for you to have realistic expectations of yourself. The other thing is, spend time grieving intentionally. Be patient with yourself. If you avoid grieving, that's going to cause a problem. A lot of people avoid feeling emotions, mostly because they don't know how to do that. We're not born knowing how to deal with our emotions. And oftentimes parents aren't very good at teaching us everything we need to know because they didn't learn when they were kids. So that leaves people oftentimes struggling with things like grief and not really sure how to do that. I always tell people, well, you have two options. You can either make the time to grieve and feel it and move through it, work through it, or you cannot. That is a choice, and it will just pop up and surprise you when you least expect it. It could be getting triggered with as simple as smelling a perfume that your mother used to wear, and that can send you in a tailspin. Whereas if you spend time grieving, going through your grief process with intention and focus, that's less likely to happen, or if it does happen, it will not be nearly as severe as if you don't make that time. And that's something that a lot of times people just don't understand, is we don't have to deal with our emotions, but in order for us to not experience our emotions dealing with us, we kind of have to. Those are the two choices, really. Now, you can sit down, for example, and write a letter to the person if you feel like you have some things unsaid that maybe you would like to express. You can sit down and make a list about the things you miss about a person or about a job or about coworkers. Things like that. You might even grieve a car. I mean, it just is really different for everybody. But one of the worst things you can do is not to deal with it, right? Because that can just end up bad. You also want to seek out social support and social activities. So for those people that want to just isolate, you can you can allow that for yourself for a bit. It's okay to meet yourself where you're at. And so what amount of time is too much or too little? Who knows? I mean, if you're isolating for a couple of months and beyond that, that's probably when you want to think that maybe it's time to do something more about it, like see a professional. But if you don't feel really like being around people for those first couple of months, that's probably okay, because some of that is going to be expected. There are people that want to be more social when they experience a loss, and that's fine as long as they are not overcompensating for the pain that they feel by feeling that void or emptiness with people and activities. So that's just something to keep in mind. There are even grief and loss support groups. And groups are for some people, and for some people, they just can't imagine even being in a room full of strangers, quote unquote, where they can talk about those things. But sometimes talking to strangers who have been through similar things to you can be very helpful. And then you walk out the door and you kind of leave it there, and you don't have to worry about what you said or how you said it, or, did you worry that person about you? You don't have to worry about any of that. So there's a lot to be said about support groups. And just because you are grieving, it doesn't mean you have to grieve all the time either. In fact, I'll tell people after they're kind of in their grief process for a while, maybe several months, I'll suggest to them to take some time off from grieving. So say like there's a breakup that's happened. And of course, everybody, when there's a breakup that's happened, there's that obsessing about the other person or obsessing trying to fill their space and dating too soon and things like that. So I'll tell the person, well, how about if you make yourself a deal that for every hour, you're just going to allow yourself to think about that person for 10 minutes. And that can be really, really helpful. So there's more of like an ebb and flow to the grief process rather than just feeling saturated in sadness. Because actually there's more to grief than sadness. You might celebrate the person that you lost. For example, if you have somebody that's passed away, or say you have coworkers, that you had to leave because you got a promotion, you might celebrate the people and celebrate the person and write and acknowledge what the differences that they made to your life. And maybe even tell the person. And might that involve some sadness? Yeah, it will. But there will also be a lot of joy involved. I think that's why a lot of times people avoid grief, is because they think it has to be all sadness. And again, people will be able to do any of these things I mentioned depending on where they're at in their grief process. So don't listen to this podcast and be trying to tell someone, see, that's what you need to be doing when, maybe they lost their mom 2 weeks ago. It may not apply right at this point for that person, but at some point it will. So it's good to share information and then just meet the person where they're at. The other really important thing is to take your self-care seriously when you're grieving. So sometimes the role that a person can play in the family or in their community or with friends or at work is to be the caretaker. And so sometimes they are good at taking care of everybody else but themselves. So be sure that you don't leave yourself out. And then also be sure and take care of your regular health habits like diet and nutrition. Try to eat. So many people, when they go through a loss, they don't want to eat. And again, that's okay for a little bit, but we have to eat. Like, that's just part of maintaining our health. I've told people before, just eat an orange even, get something nutritious in your body. You can't let your health go. And so that's really important. Exercise and physical activity is really important, even if you don't feel like it. Even if you don't feel like getting out of bed, give yourself a reason to get out of bed, even if it's for 10 minutes. I think the degree to which you do any of these in terms of the expectations you have of yourself or others is really important too. Any amount of doing these attempts to cope in a healthy way are better than nothing. So if all you can muster up is to walk downstairs or to your mailbox, and spend 5 minutes walking and come right back home, then that's better than nothing. And then with sleep, you want to avoid things that would disrupt your sleep in general. So maybe not be checking social media or watching TV because of the light and the impact that has on the ability to sleep anyways. You might not want to do those things. Really be more attentive when you're going through the grief process. Absolutely talk to family or friends who are there and who are supportive. Some people don't have that, believe it or not. Some people do not have a support system. So that's where seeking professional help or going to a support group can be helpful. But just journaling too is a really great way to release things. You might read poetry or books, engage in social activities, like I said, seek spiritual support. There are many people that is their place for comfort. I have a spiritual mentor who's in New York, and I meet with her once a month, and that is really, really good on so many levels, to meet with her and just talk about life or talk about career or all kinds of things. And then another coping mechanism is to take time to relax. Absolutely, take time to relax. Because when we go through something emotionally, it's not just mentally and emotionally that we go through it. Our body goes through all of it as well. So during the time that you're grieving, you might even get some energy work done. Go get a massage. Go get Reiki. Go get quantum alignment. Anything, go do yoga, anything like that to help those emotions, possibly traumatic emotions, right? Depending on the nature of the death or if it is a death. You want to keep that energy moving through and out your body so that it does not get stuck, because that can oftentimes cause health problems, believe it or not. And then listening to music. I know that's one of my big coping mechanisms, is listening to music. And I'll listen to all kinds of music, depending on what the reason is that I'm listening to that music for. There's such a thing as frequency music that is set to certain frequencies that actually interact with the brain in a way to promote healing. So you can do a listen to frequency music specifically set to help with grief and loss. And I'll probably post a link to a YouTube. I'll do a little bit of research on that and post that later on Facebook and Instagram, and also on the Remotely Unique website. Biggest thing I would say, and the final thing I would say, is to really let yourself feel grief. So important. No one can make you feel or experience or take the time to grieve. No one can make you do that, unfortunately. So it's something you have to kind of come to terms with yourself that's necessary, and then decide how you're going to do that. And again, that's where going to counseling or a spiritual mentor or your pastor or priest or religious person can be really helpful so that they can help guide you. Because when you're going through your own grief process, it's not always easy to guide your own ship, so to speak. It's really nice to have somebody to lean on to help you do that. And I know that because I've been to lots of counseling in my lifetime. And that's been really helpful when I've done it. Really, really helpful for a variety of reasons. All right, well, that is my section on grief and loss today. If you are experiencing grief and loss and you need some help or want more information or anything, please reach out to me. You can text me at 505-315-7397, or you can visit remotely-unique.com and send a message through the website. You can also retrieve this podcast through the website, and I'll also post it on Instagram and Facebook later. You can also get it through iTunes, which is really exciting. And I think we're also going to try to get it on Spotify as well, so stay tuned. You have a wonderful day. If you are in the midst of grief, which all of us have had that come up with the pandemic, be patient with yourself. All right, have a great day. Make it a great week, in fact. And I'll talk to you next Monday.